Welcome back to Armpit Intellectuals. This is the digital basement where we stop treating global thought like a dusty museum exhibit and start treating it like the high stakes survival manual it actually is. I'm Zara.
And I am Bilal. In our last episode, we broke down the so called Big Three: Edward Said, Franz Fanon, and Iqbal Ahmad. They gave us the structural blueprint of how empire works. They showed us the skeleton of power, the borders, the binaries, and the grand narratives of resistance. But let's be real, a blueprint isn't a building. You can map power perfectly and still never feel how it presses down on your chest. It's like having a map of a minefield but still being the one walking through it in flip flops.
We're moving from the architecture of the state to the architecture of the soul. Today, we're looking at the women who walked into that building. The big three mapped out, tapped the walls, pointed the cracked foundations, and asked a question that still makes people in the academy and the streets sweat through their shirts. Why is half the population still stuck in the basement? And why do we keep calling that basement culture or tradition or national development instead of naming it as localized domestic violence?
We're calling this episode the Matriarchy of Disruption. We're diving into the work of Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, Bell Hooks, and Arundhati Roy. These aren't just names on a syllabus. They are the thinkers who realize that if your anti colonial revolution doesn't have a plan for the kitchen, the bedroom, and your own internal wiring, then you haven't actually kicked the colonizer out. You've just invited him to change into a dhoti and stay for dinner. Khana kha ke jana.
The big three focused on the macro, the clash of civilizations, and the fall of direct colonial rule. Big stuff. World Cup stuff. But these women force us to look at the micro and the meso. They argue that the empire didn't just pack its bags and retreat to Europe, it diffused. It's like a bad smell that lingers in the curtains. It's in the way we speak, the way we love, and the way we govern our own people. They didn't just add women's issues to the list of grievances like a last minute grocery item. They fundamentally rewired the logic of what liberation actually looks like.
This is about the friction between the public hero and the private reality. While the male led movements of the 20th century were busy claiming the national space, shouting into megaphones and looking heroic for the history books, these women were pointing out that the national was being built on the backs of women whose labor remained unpaid and whose voices were treated like background noise. They shifted the focus from the sovereignty of the state to the sovereignty of the person.
So, buckle up. We are going beyond the great men of history to look at the thinkers who refused to let the revolution be a boys' club. If the last episode was about diagnoses, identifying the cancer of colonialism, this one is about complications. Because decolonization isn't clean. It's not a surgical cut where you remove the European and suddenly the body is doing yoga. It's a messy, ongoing process of changing language, intimacy, desire, and the stories we tell ourselves about what so-called progress means.
The earlier canon, Said's Orientalism, Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, often framed power as a horizontal tug of war, West versus rest. These thinkers complicate that picture with a vertical axis.
They force us to see elite versus subaltern, state versus people, and patriarch versus everyone else. This isn't a live, laugh, love version of intersectionality. It's a survival tool. It's a way of recognizing that a revolution that liberates the nation but leaves the domestic worker or the rural woman in chains is just a rebranding exercise. If the post colonial state uses the same paramilitary forces to clear indigenous land for a corporate dam that the British used to clear land for a railroad, then for the person being displaced, so called independence is just a ghost story with a new narrator. And I want to say this up front. Encountering these thinkers for the first time can feel destabilizing. It's meant to. And I remember reading Spivak in university and feeling a hot flush of embarrassment. Not because the prose was dense, though definitely it is. Reading Spivak is like trying to chew through a dictionary. But it was because I realized how often I had confused my own privilege with advocacy. I realized I had been speaking for people I hadn't spent a single day listening to.
That discomfort is the threshold. If you aren't feeling some friction in your own identity, if you aren't questioning whether your radical politics are actually just a way to make yourself feel better while keeping your status intact, then you probably aren't reading them closely enough. These women are here to disrupt the blueprints and force us to look at the living, breathing, and often suffering people inside the building. If Edward Sayes taught us that the West imagines the East, Spivak is the one standing at the back of the lecture hall asking, okay, but which East are you talking about? And who's getting a paycheck for that answer?
Spivak is a literary theorist who took the tools of European deconstruction, Derrida, Marx, Gramsci, and turned them back on the intellectual elite. Her most famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, isn't actually a question. It's a provocation aimed directly at people who think good intentions and a free Palestine sticker are enough.
By subaltern, she's borrowing from Antonio Gramsci to describe people so structurally excluded, economically, socially, linguistically, that the system literally cannot register what they're saying. It's not that they're silent, it's that the microphone was never wired for their frequency. Think of the hundreds of millions of people living in extreme poverty. Their survival strategies rarely make it into IMF policy papers or the discourse of the supposedly liberated post colonial university.
One of Spivak's most unsettling arguments is that the subaltern isn't just the poor, it's the person whose entire framework for reality has been overwritten. And this is where she introduces epistemic violence, the harm done when you replace someone's lived reality with your own explanation of it. It's like someone telling you that you aren't actually hungry. You're just experiencing economic recalibration. She captures the colonial mindset with a line that still stings. White men are saving brown women from brown men. She uses the British ban on sati in India as an example, not to defend the practice, but to expose how colonial powers used women's suffering as moral cover to justify their rule, while local patriarchs used tradition as cover for theirs. In both cases, the woman herself was never asked what she wanted. She became a silent sight for other people's arguments.
This is where Spivak makes people nervous, especially progressive people, because she argues that giving voice to the marginalized is often just another performance of power, a way of centering yourself as the enlightened translator. I remember sitting on a panel where someone said very proudly, I speak for refugee women, and I thought of Spivak immediately. Who asked you to speak? And what did you refuse to hear so you could keep talking? Spivak doesn't offer comfort, she offers a demand. Unlearn your privilege as your loss, meaning what you've been trained to value as knowledge may actually be shrinking your capacity to understand the world. Your credentials, your fluency in theory, even your moral certainty might be the very wall separating you from the subaltern.
Moving from the archive to the interior, we arrive at bell hooks. She deliberately chose to write her name in lowercase to keep the focus on her work rather than the author. And the work is relentless because it refuses to let anyone off the hook, including the guys who read Fanon once and now think they're revolutionaries. Hooks gives us one of the most precise definitions of the system we're up against: the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. She refused to shorten it. Because if you only fight racism but leave patriarchy intact, or challenge patriarchy without touching capitalism, the system simply reboots under a more progressive brand. It's like deleting a virus but keeping the operating system that invited it in.
What distinguishes Hooks, especially in this trio, is her insistence that domination is not just external, it lives inside us. Her concept of the will to change comes out of her work on masculinity, where she makes a claim that felt revolutionary in the 1990s and still does today. Patriarchy is a form of soul murder for men.
And she argued that from a young age, boys are trained to amputate their emotional selves in exchange for a narrow version of power. In the US, the statistics back this up. Men are roughly 3.9 times more likely to die by suicide than women. A figure Hooks would link to the emotional mutilation demanded by the system. She looked at liberation movements and noticed something deeply uncomfortable. Men would fight against racial domination, win space and authority, and then recreate the same hierarchies in their homes. Freedom that only changes who gets to hold the whip isn't freedom at all. And in the words of another Black scholar, Audre Lorde, the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house.
For Hooks, love is not sentimental. It's not a rom com. It's disciplined. It's a practice. She defines it as the will to nurture one's own and another's spiritual growth. That means accountability. It means unlearning entitlement. It means refusing to confuse control with care. This is the heart of all about love, and it's also her quiet indictment of movements that demand justice in public while reproducing harm in private.
And this is where Hooks subtly diverges from a purely structural politics. She believes transformation has to reach the intimate level, how we love, parent, desire, and relate. Otherwise, political change won't last. Rage can expose injustice, but love is what prevents us from rebuilding the same empire with better slogans. If the revolutionary hasn't confronted their own will to dominate, they will eventually become the new oppressor, just with better music. Now, if Hooks works on the interior, Arundhati Roy works in public, loudly, inconveniently, and without institutional permission. She's what happens when a world class novelist decides the state should be interrogated with the same precision as a sentence.
After winning massive literary acclaim, Roy walked away from respectability to fight the Narmada Dam projects in India. She didn't see development, she saw the displacement of over 200,000 people, the militarization of the landscape, and the recycling of colonial logic under a nationalist flag. Progress, she argues, often just means someone else pays the price while you get a faster internet connection.
Roy is where Spivak's silence and Hook's love meet the bulldozer. She insists on speaking, even when speaking comes at enormous personal cost. And this is where tension emerges. Spivak warns us about the dangers of representation, how speaking for the subaltern can erase them. Roy, watching villages drown and activists disappear into prisons, refuses quietism. The friction between them is productive. It forces us to ask when silence is ethical and when it's just cowardice disguised as theory.
Roy names the new empire. It isn't ruled by kings, by the contracts. It isn't justified by religion, but by GDP. She asks a devastating question. If we replace the British with a local elite using the same police, the same prisons, and the same sedition laws, did we actually decolonize? Or did we just change the color of the hand on the throat?
She famously said, "There's no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." Whether she's writing about Kashmir, privatized water, or corporate democracy, Roy dismantles the language of power itself, how growth becomes an euphemism for theft, and security becomes a euphemism for state terror. She forces us to look at the small things, individual lives, rivers, forests, crushed by the big things of state and capital.
Now, when you put Spivak, Hooks, and Roy in conversation, the map changes. Liberation stops being an abstract horizon and becomes a daily uncomfortable practice.
It moves from the library to the kitchen to the street, from how we write and speak, to how we love and argue, and to how we show up when the state demands obedience. From Spivak, we learn that language can wound, that even help can be violent if it refuses to listen to the specific reality of the subaltern, the voiceless, the forcibly voiceless. From Hooks, we learn that without the will to change ourselves and our relationships, political victories will remain hollow. And from Roy, we learn that empire survives perfectly well without foreign rulers. It just needs paperwork, police, and a population trained to look the other way.
Together, they refuse the fantasy of a single savior or a single revolution. Decolonization is intersectional, intimate, and collective. It asks us, who are you speaking for? Who are you loving? And what are you willing to give up to stop reproducing the very world you claim to oppose?
It's exhausting work, but as bell hooks reminded us, it's the only work that actually makes us free.
Thanks for listening to Armpit Intellectuals. Next episode, we shift from the individual to the institution, motherhood, and the state.
We'll be excavating the nationalization of the mother archetype, how states draft care, sacrifice, and honor into service of their most violent projects, and how the motherland becomes a way to justify the wars that kill mothers' children.
See you next time. And as always, keep digging beneath the surface.